Welcome to the FAFSA Leadership Lounge, where we dive into the politics shaping the work of Florida school leaders. I'm Michelle White, Executive Director of the Florida Association of School Administrators.
And I'm Jessica Jana Stewart, lobbyist for FAFSA in several school districts across the state of Florida.
So let's start this week off with some congratulations. In last week's podcast, we discussed a number of special elections that are coming up, and we have the results for two of them.
That's right. And these folks will be joining us during the upcoming legislative session. The first, congratulations goes to Senator Ralph Masulo, that's State Senate District 11. And you may recall he was the one who was running to replace former Senator Angolia, now our financial officer of the state. That was his Senate seat that he vacated when he was appointed to that position. He is, of course, running for CFO also. That'll be upcoming in the 2026 election. But he was running to replace him. He was a former House member, so he'll be familiar to some of our listeners who have been coming to Tallahassee for the past couple of years. And then also we now have Representative-elect Rob Long. That's from State House District 90. So he will be replacing the former representative who actually passed away this year.
And at the local level, we want to say congratulations to Eileen Higgins. She is the mayor-elect for the city of Miami. So notable about Ms. Higgins is that she is the first Democratic mayor for Miami in the last 28 years.
Wow. And those the other seats that we mentioned, our senator and representative, is important to note. They both kept the same party. So there's no change then in the makeup of the Senate or the House based on these elections. The Senator Masulo was replacing Blaise Angolia, a Republican. He's also a Republican. And then Rob Long, that seat was a Democratic seat, and he is a Democrat. So no change there in makeup.
And still starting session then with a supermajority of Republicans in both the House and the Senate.
That's right. And also last week, we had the governor unveil his 26-27 budget proposal. This is a requirement by law that the governor provide his budget proposal. And of course, we all know it is the legislature that does ultimately build the budget, but the governor, of course, can have a lot of influence. Certainly, we've seen during his tenure as governor, he has had tremendous influence on some of the budget decisions that the legislature made. So it gives us a sense of what he is going to be pushing for and advocating for during the legislative session. And then it also is kind of our first starting point. And we'll see then what the legislature chooses to do with some of his recommendations or not. I think for us in the education space, probably the most notable thing is his proposal to remove the scholarships from our FEFP calculation. That is something that the Senate has proposed. The House has been pretty vocal that they don't think that is a good idea, but it looks like it's shaping up at least to with his proposal. And now we know from the Senate that at least those two entities seem to think it would be a good idea to pull those scholarships out. So in addition to that, just his initial proposal for the entire budget is a $117 billion budget. He does put money in reserves and also some dollars towards debt reduction. That is pretty normal. We've seen that from him during each of his proposals.
Absolutely. So let's talk about how it's being invested in K-12 education specifically. So the governor's budget provides a record $30.6 billion in funding. Some of the highlights of this budget include $1.5 billion to provide salary increases to teachers and other instructional personnel, $1.7 billion for early childhood education, including $483.4 million specifically for VPK programs.
And his numbers, of course, are based on at least the most current information that we have when it comes to projections for what we think we're going to have enrollment-wise. So it is important to note that in his calculation, we do have district enrollment declining by about 27,000 students and scholarship enrollment increasing by about 46,000 students. Again, that's a projection. We'll have better numbers as we move throughout the legislative session. And of course, that's what they'll ultimately build their budget on, is the most accurate and recent numbers. But he is at least recommending an increase for schools to our to our BSA, which is great.
Yeah, and of that, the $30 billion specifically for traditional public schools and charter non-voucher amounts, that's a little over $26 billion with about $4 billion set aside from the FEFP for vouchers.
That's right. And he does also provide, or at least is asking for, an increase in our safe schools allocation, which we know certainly that's been a priority for FAFSA school safety. And we certainly know that, just like many of our other categoricals, districts are spending a lot more than what they receive for school safety. So any increase is certainly welcome there. So he is asking for an increase there. And he's also included $10 billion for the Florida Civic Seal of Excellence program. So that's obviously something he's going to be championing.
Yeah. So last week was the 6th and final week of the interim committee weeks. It was referred to as AI week at the Capitol, and a number of the scheduled committee meetings had presentations from AI experts discussing how the technology can affect different sectors of the workforce. There definitely was a lot of conversation about really post-graduation from K-12 space and what does the workforce look like and how do we prepare students for that, and looking forward.
And it seemed in our committees, they were talking a great deal, some of the districts that were there, explaining what they do now with regard to the use of AI, that one of the key factors is professional development for teachers and then leaders, just to really know how to use it properly and then, effectively for students.
And I think it's really interesting too that over the end of last week, we saw from the federal level, the president sign an executive order that basically supersedes and to certain extents nullifies any state policies that are put in place. So we're kind of seeing a little dynamic of struggle, I guess, between the president and the governor, where the governor is saying we do need to take a look at AI and develop policies around that and what it means for our state. And the president is pushing the brakes.
That's right. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out, certainly here in Florida, but across the country as well, as I'm sure other states or conversations to ours. One thing that came up seemingly in a number of committees, not just education, but at least was an acknowledgement that maybe we should have done more at the advent of media and other really, but certainly with social media and all the access that students and kids have had. And perhaps we need to think in the same way about AI. It's a wonderful tool, but how do we make sure that kids are using it safely and that it's a positive thing? Mm-hmm. But the presentations were very interesting. I'm sure that's not the last we are going to hear about a topic during the legislative session, but it's certainly not all that happened. There were some pretty impactful bills that were heard this week. So in the Senate Education 12 Committee, there were two bills that were heard that then did advance out of committee. The first, Senate Bill 124, deals with the Florida virtual school and to develop state-of-the-art technology-based education delivery system, makes them to how they operate. That was voted on favorably. And then, of course, we had
Senate Bill 320 on administrative efficiency in public schools, or what we are affectionately calling school deregulation 3.0, as this is the third year that we have had some form of this bill. It was also heard in committee. We're gonna dig in to the details of that. But to note, it only has one more stop before it's ready for the House floor, and that'll be in the fiscal policy area. But a few tweaks from last year.
Yes. So as our stars may recall, they're probably the most controversial piece of the bill was the elimination of the requirement to pass the 10th grade ELA and math requirement. And so you'd still have to take those exams, but you wouldn't have to happen to graduate, was what the proposal was last year. So other than the elimination of that 10th grade ELA and House Rule 1 requirement to graduate, it does keep many of the same provisions that we saw last year. So we have a 3-year instructional multi-year contract. It establishes a 10-year renewable professional certificate. It removes the prescribed 5-year, 10-year, and 20-year school facility work program mandates, but it does maintain the requirements for district long-term facility planning. It allows school districts to use proceeds from their 1.5 mil discretionary capital levy for operational and capital purposes. That was something that in committee, Senator Gates talked about. While districts may enjoy that flexibility, that may be something that down the road, they regret asking more. He was just pointing that out. So, but that remains in the bill. And then it importantly does allow school district boards to determine the need to make up days lost because of an actual emergency.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly we were very lucky or have been lucky thus far during this school year that we have not had hurricanes that we have had the last couple of years. But we certainly know what it's like when you have those years where you have a couple scares, schools have to cancel, be it either for folks to evacuate or to open their schools as shelters. And so kids are out for a number of days. And when those pile on top of each other, you have more than one or some other kind of emergency situation. It can be challenging when you have to do makeup days. So this would allow districts to make that determination on their own.
Yeah, and the bill in committee had, there were some great questions by all of the committee members that were there. And, the willingness of Senator Simon to answer every question and make sure that there is an understanding of what this bill really does and how this ultimately helps our students by helping our districts and schools. So unanimous support across the board. Democrats and Republicans were enthusiastic, I would say, about supporting it. And hopefully we'll get to see that continue and move forward all the way through the process.
That would be fantastic. Senator Simon, in some of his comments, did mention that, the original GREG bill was proposed following the expansion of the scholarship program to make it universal, with the idea being that if we're going to have a competitive space where we have all these different choice options, we need to ensure that our traditional public schools don't have a myriad of additional requirements that are not found in the other choice options. So if we're going to compete, let's let everybody kind of play by the same rules, essentially. And he mentioned that again in committee. And I certainly think that's appreciated that he has kept that in his mind and continued to work for that year after year.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we did also have our big appropriations committee meet. And typically that committee is something that we don't see a lot meeting during interim committee weeks. It's one that takes the forefront as we get into session and the latter parts of the legislative session. But they did meet this past week and they heard two important bills, both of which did pass unanimously. The first one, Senate Bill 318, that is sponsored by Senator Gates. That is all about looking at the scholarship system and trying to make some fixes based on the audits that we discussed, I think, in one of our previous podcasts, with some of the issues that they have seen, primarily making sure that the money does follow the student to whatever choice option they have, and ensure that, where they are is where the money is going, and that we're not releasing funds without knowing where these students are. In that proposal is his idea that we should take those scholarships out of the FEFP and have them be their own separate line item. So we mentioned, of course, the governor championing that, obviously, also in his budget, but this is where that lives in this Senate bill. And then this is really just trying to make some tweaks to fix some of the problems that we had discussed previously.
Yeah. And, again, to your point of it being similar to what the governor wants, on the House side, they don't want these scholarships moved out. And I think it mentioned it in a couple episodes ago of the podcast, but they, our education appropriations chair said that if they were to move that money out, that she believes that would be detrimental to school choice within the state of Florida. And of course, both sides have agreed and disagreed on, does that truly end choice? And even those on the Senate that are in the same party are like, this is not going to end choice. We are here to stay with choice. So interesting. But
Very.
the second bill that committee heard was Senate Bill 250, and it was sponsored by Senator Corey Simon. It addresses the rural community development to help with everything from schools to road improvements and rural communities. So Senator Simon sponsored a similar bill last year. It failed to pass in the House. This really is a big priority for our Senate president. Both of these bills, they only have one committee stop. So if you don't think that the Senate president loves these two bills, let me just say he is over the moon about them hopefully passing, because one committee stop, they both passed unanimously, and now they're ready for the floor when we come back in January.
So I would imagine, will be some of the first bills that are passed off the Senate floor when they come back for session. And so then we will have to see what the House decides to do. Obviously, with the rural bill and the dereg bill that we talked about previously, those didn't go anywhere last year on the Senate side, or on the House side rather. So we shall have to stay tuned to see what happens there. But it certainly is, to your point, very clearly a major priority for the Senate president. Over on the House side, their Education Pre-K-12 Approach Committee met, and they received an update from the DOE, from their Division of Early Learning, about various childhood initiatives, looking at the School Readiness Plus program, as well as an update on the VPK Summer Bridge program. So the School Readiness Plus program is part of the state's broader school readiness framework, which aims to support low-income families, their access to early learning and childcare, and to provide continuity as families transition from being eligible for this program. And of course, VPK Summer Bridge program, that's designed to help rising kindergartners who score low on their readiness assessment, to help them get up to speed so that when they enter school in the fall, they're ready to go.
Absolutely. So it was definitely a busy week last week. We are definitely looking forward to the next couple of weeks, as I hope you are too, our listeners. Remember that our legislative session will begin officially on January 13th, and we look forward to continuing to bring the FAFSA Leadership Lounge to you. Also, our Advocate 26 conference is going to be January 26th through the 28th in Tallahassee. We are closing in on 200 people registered this year, and it's going to be one of the largest conferences that we have had, with administrators canvassing every office in the Capitol. But we look forward to this amazing and impactful event. We hope that you have a wonderful break. Take the time to refresh and be with family, and we will talk to you in January.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lounge podcast, presented by the Florida Association of School Administrators. Today's podcast was hosted by Michelle White and Jessica Janasiewicz. Podcast was produced by Jeff Willoughby. Original musical recordings by David Higgins. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. New episodes are released each Monday. For show topics, suggestions, questions, or comments, please email communications@fasa.net. We hope you enjoyed the show.